Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak at this Brazilian Congress. And it's my huge pleasure and honor to be speaking about some important aspects regarding cancer clinical trials that all patients and advocates of cancer should be aware of. I'm Dr. Vishal Gyawali. I'm an assistant professor at Queen's University, Kingston, Canada. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So the first thing is about the importance of clinical trials. We always see this sentence being told again and again that clinical trials are always the best option for patients. That's absolutely true. But there is an important caveat to that. Not all clinical trials are patient-centric and well-designed. So participating in a clinical trial that is not patient-centric and well-designed is not a good idea. So clinical trials are always the best option for patients, should be taken with a grain of salt. Only well-designed patient-centric clinical trials are worth participating in. Only well-designed and patient-centric clinical trials are the best option. So what do I mean by that? That means all clinical trials do not necessarily solve the patient agenda. For example, a trial that is designed from the outset to test clinically irrelevant marginal differences. I'll give you an example. This paper from Lancet Oncology in 2016 was testing a drug for advanced ovarian cancer versus placebo, and the conclusion was this drug significantly increased progression-free survival. So when you read this sentence, the drug significantly increased progression-free survival, you would assume that there must be some substantial improvement. But actually, if you read the results, then there was an improvement of only 18, not months, but days. Just 18 days, and this is not even survival. This is a surrogate endpoint. But it is statistically significant. The p-value is less than 0.05, so this sentence is not wrong, but it is quite meaningless, an improvement of 18 days. So how did this such a small difference of 18 days become significant? Because this trial recruited more than 1,350 patients, a huge number of patients. If you recruit a huge number of patients, then all small differences can look significant. So that means this trial was designed from the outset to detect such a small difference as significant. That means there was no confidence in the efficacy of this drug to begin with. So there would be no point for a patient to participate in a trial that was designed to detect such a small difference as significant. If you want to read more about this particular trial, then I recommend you to read this paper that I saw at the bottom of the slide. This is an open access paper. So let's continue with the examples of clinical trials that don't solve patient agenda. The other is a trial that ignores patient-related outcomes or quality of life. We had done this study in 2018 in which we looked at 352 phase 3 randomized trials for advanced cancer, and we found that 50% of them, they did not even include quality of life as an endpoint. And of those that did, 25% did not report pre-specified quality of life endpoint. So this means a trial is being done for a drug and patients are recruited, but they are not collecting the information on how the patients feel while on the drug. If it is a good drug, then the patients are supposed to feel better after taking the drug. But if you are asked to enroll onto a trial and there is no plan to collect quality of life data, or there is no plan to publish quality of life data, then you should take that with some suspicion. Altogether, in these trials, we found that there were 125,000 patients whose quality of life outcomes we do not know. So this is a huge waste of patient resources. And patients, they always tell us that one of the reasons why they enroll into trial is to help science and to help future patients from the knowledge that comes out of this trial. But if we are not collecting this information, this is not going to help anyone. The other example is a trial that is conducted without rationale. Now, what do I mean by that? We looked at a number of negative phase 3 trials, that failed, phase 3 trials that failed. And we found that actually more than 40% of these negative phase 3 trials were conducted without a supporting phase 2. Now, usually a drug is tested in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So we found that 40% of the trials that failed in phase 3 actually did not have any a supporting phase 2. And 14% of these actually had a negative phase 2. Now, this is quite mind-boggling. A drug failed in a phase 2, but still was tested in a phase 3, and it became negative in a phase 3. Now, there is no benefit for patients in participating in a trial that ultimately failed because that drug did not show benefit. Now, again, there is always a chance that the drug may not work and the trial may be negative. But if we know from the beginning that the drug has already failed in a phase 2 trial, then the chances that the drug will fail in a phase 3 is pretty high because it has already failed before in a phase 2. So if you are participating in a phase 3 trial, you should, as a patient, you should always be asking for the phase 2 data. You should ask whether the drug was already tested in a phase 2 and whether it was proven to be effective in a phase 2. The other example is a trial that uses non-inferiority design inappropriately. For example, in liver cancer, there was a new drug called lenvatinib that was tested against the standard of care sorafenib. And sorafenib is an oral drug. It has some side effects. Lenvatinib is also an oral drug, and it also has a number of side effects. So there was no point in testing this drug in a non-inferiority design. And in fact, lenvatinib is much more expensive than sorafenib. In a non-inferiority trial, what we are asking is whether this new drug is not worse than the drug that we already have. Now, that might sound crazy. Why would someone want to test a new drug if it is as whether or not it is worse than the drug that we already have? Because we need drugs that are better than what we already have. But non-inferiority does make sense in a couple of conditions. If the new drug is cheaper, if the new drug is less invasive, like oral versus injection, and if the new drug is given, let's say, once every month instead of once every week, or if the new drug has a better quality of life, it does make sense. However, in this particular incident, there was no such benefit, and still the drug was tested in a non-inferiority design. And the other example is of a trial that uses inappropriate crossover and a trial that uses a substandard control arm. What do I mean by these things? Please allow me to. Crossover means whether or not the patients in the control arm will receive the drug in the experimental arm when they progress. Now, sometimes this is rational and should be done. Sometimes this is irrational and should not be done. For example, this drug abiraterone, it was already approved for castration-resistant prostate cancer. It was already approved. It showed improved survival. And in this trial, we tested whether the same drug was effective in castration-sensitive in earlier course of treatment. But what happened was, after the disease progression, patients who were getting placebo in this trial, they should have received abiraterone because abiraterone was already approved. So they should have received the drug when they progressed. But we saw that only 11% of the patients who got placebo actually received abiraterone when they progressed. So that means the survival difference that we are seeing in this trial could simply be because the patients in the control arm, they did not get an effective drug when they progressed. In another example, again from prostate cancer, this was a trial of Sipuleucel T, a vaccine. We saw that patients in the placebo arm, they went on to receive this vaccine when they progressed, when in fact these vaccines had never been approved before. So we didn't know that they were effective. In that case, when these patients in the control arm, they progress, they should have received an effective treatment that has already been approved, like docetaxel, which is quite effective. But they wanted to receive something else, and they lost time in getting this unproven treatment. And that's why we see that this drug actually has only one response. There is no effect on tumor progression, but it improved overall survival. And this could simply be because the patients in the control arm, they were denied an effective treatment for a long time. So this Eviratron example is an example of a crossover that should have happened but did not happen. And Sipuleucel T is an example of a crossover that should not have happened but happened. And we also talked about substandard control arm. Whenever you are participating in the trial, there is an experimental arm and there is a control arm, and you could be randomized to any of these arms. So you should always ask what the control arm treatment would be, because sometimes the trial could be using an inferior control arm in order to show the experimental drug as effective when it is not so. And that can happen in two ways. One, they could be using a control arm treatment that is already known to be inferior to another treatment, or they could use a placebo when an active treatment option is the standard of care. For example, in case of ASCENT-4 trial for ALK positive non-small cell lung cancer, ceritinib was compared against platinum chemo, when in fact crizotinib had already received approval for ALK positive first-line lung cancer. It had received approval in 2011 and full approval in 2013. But this trial ran from 2013 to 2015 when we already knew crizotinib was effective, and patients, if they were not a part of the trial, they would have received crizotinib. But because they were a part of the trial, they got platinum chemo, which we already knew was worse than crizotinib. The other example of using a placebo inappropriately, patients with metastatic pancreatic cancer, they get chemotherapy like FOLFIRINOX. And if they respond to chemotherapy, we continue chemotherapy because this is quite a lethal cancer. But in this particular trial of Olaparib, patients in the control arm, they were stopped on the chemo after 16 weeks and they just went on to receive placebo. So these patients got placebo when they should have received active chemotherapy in the control arm. So we discussed about various issues, but what can we do? So I think the most important policy change is that we need to get patients more involved. We need patient empowerment and patient involvement for every aspect of trial design and launch and conduct and result dissemination. The patients should be at the center. We talked about non-inferiority design trials earlier. We looked at all the non-inferiority design of design trials for cancer drugs, and we saw that the non-inferiority design was not appropriate in 40% of them. And the definition of non-inferiority was up to 1.33. That means here is the non-inferiority definition for these trials. That means up to 33% increase in the risk of dying was considered to be not worse. It was considered to be acceptable. But there is no basis for that. Like the trialists or nobody asked the patients up to what margin of non-inferiority is acceptable. Did the patients actually consider up to 33% increase in the risk of mortality as acceptable? No, we do not know. So we have to ask patients' opinion in deciding these things. You know, whenever you read a clinical trial report, the side effects are reported in such a way. The toxicities of the cancer drugs are considered to be acceptable. But acceptable to whom? We have never asked patients whether the side effect was acceptable or not. Chronic diarrhea, going to bathroom 10 times a day for 5 months. The trial report says the toxicity profile is favorable. It was well tolerated. But we have not asked the patients. Only the patients can decide what is acceptable or tolerable side effect. So we need to get patient input every aspect, and we need to educate the patient as well. We just talked about placebo control arm. Sometimes the placebo arm is justified. Sometimes the placebo arm is not justified. So we need to teach the patients about these concepts, about double-blind study, placebo arms, and things like that. And some of the patients get surprised with financial toxicity of clinical trials because, whenever we talk about clinical trials, we say that the drug is for free, but the drug is not the only thing. there might be other hidden costs that the patient is not aware of. So I guess I have summarized a couple of key questions that the patient should be asking before getting enrolled in a clinical trial in order to ensure that the clinical trial is patient-centric. And here is a list of the questions that I think you can take a note of and you can consider before enrolling into the trial. You should be asking about the control arm, what is the standard of care, if you are not a part of the trial, what is the treatment that you receive, and is that still a part of the trial, and is doing nothing an option, active surveillance for a number of cancers, what phase of the clinical trial it is, what is the hypothesis, is it a randomized trial, is it a are you testing whether the drug is not worse, or are you testing whether the drug is better, what are the side effects, what is the effect on quality of life, what is the other extra burden I need to face, and whether or not you are going to publish this. So this is my final word. We need to always keep in mind that trials are there to solve patients. It's not the other way around. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure, and I'm happy to answer your questions by email or other methods. Thank you.